4.1 Ethical, Legal and Health and Safety Issues in Sport and Exercise Science Research. What does ethical and legal mean? Ethical means that it is a relating to moral principles or the branch of knowledge dealing with these and the difference between right and wrong. However, legal means that it is relating to the law and working within the boundaries of the civil law. Health and safety means regulations and procedures intended to prevent accident or injuries in workplaces or public environments. According to the Health and Safety Work Act of 1974, it is the duty of every employer to ensure the health and safety and welfare at work of all employees. All of these experiments went against the ethical and legal principles, as none of the subjects were willing to take part, and there was also mass amounts of psychological and physical harm caused to them. The Nazis conducted experiments on victims of the Auschwitz concentration camp, who were tortured in order to give the Nazis funding for their experiments. Experiments involved resistance to mustard gas, how muscle nerves worked, and resistance to fatal diseases such as malaria. Because the experiment were against the will of the victims, they were forced to partake in the experiment and had no choice in the matter. These experiments caused massive amounts of physical and psychological damage. At the time, this was not against the law, but in 1947, the Nuremberg Code was made, which stopped this from being allowed. The Nuremberg Code was created and was a set of ethical and legal principles that must be followed in order for an experiment to be allowed to run. The code had 10 points which must be complied with. The main ones were: all subjects must be volunteers, studies are necessary and based on good science, the benefits must outweigh the risks, the participants must have the right to withdraw, the experiment must be conducted by a qualified researcher, it cannot cause physical or psychological harm, and other points that stopped experiments being done by people who could not give consent. Finally, the Declaration of Helsinki, which was created in 1964 by the World Medical Association, or the WMA. The Declaration is a set of ethical principles regarding experimentation on humans. The Declaration of Helsinki's main principles are similar to the Nuremberg Code, and states that it is essential participants are volunteers, the benefits should outweigh the risk, and that no physical or psychological damage should be caused to the participant. BASES stands for the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. The role of BASES is to produce a code of conduct for sport and exercise science practitioners and researchers. They also outline ethical and legal issues, as well as health and safety guidelines. The summary of BASES code and conduct is to set out the principles of code of conduct and research ethics for the guidance of members of the association. Scenario 1. The good practice was that the researcher had ethical clearance to run these tests and had been reviewed by the ethics committee. Poor practice. There were no first aid procedures carried out or told to the subjects. First aid procedures would include fire exits, first aid kits, and emergency contacts. Without these, the experiments cannot be allowed to continue due to the Declaration of Helsinki. The consequence for not going through standard first aid procedures will be minor, but if a participant is harmed because of it, the most severe consequences will occur. The consequences could be ethical training for the researcher, and that they have to receive training so that they are allowed to proceed with the experiments. The ethical training will help the researcher to better understand procedures that must be put into place before they are allowed to carry out experiments. participants must have given consent for themselves to participate, which is why some did not feel comfortable participating in the experiment. The Nuremberg Code stated that the participants must be volunteers and cannot be forced into doing activities they do not want to do. The participants are not aware of their right to withdraw, as the informed consent letter was not sent and did not brief the participants what will be happening during the test. This violates the Nuremberg Code, as the participants are not aware they can leave when they want, meaning a subject disclaimer was not given to the participants before starting the test. A consequence of violating the informed consent can cause for formal reprimand, which could lead to suspension or termination of a contract. There was no risk assessment for the experiment, which meant the parents and participants did not know what may go wrong during the experiment. Depending on the risks, a participant may not wish to go through with the experiment, and therefore, if they were to get physically or psychologically harmed, then this could lead to severe consequences for the researcher. Linking to this, no health and safety executive was brought in to check the experiment. The role of the health and safety executive is to ensure the health and safety and welfare of the researcher and subject during, before, and after the experiment has been conducted. The punishment can range from a fine or loss of accreditation, meaning in the future, the researcher will not be allowed to experiment and they will lose their credit from bases, making it difficult to find work. The researcher must show respect to the subject, to the participants, which comes under ethical principles for the researcher. This means listening to the participants' wishes throughout the experiment and not being disrespectful in any way. One way this can be done is by honoring a participant's right to withdraw, as pressuring them can be seen as omission, which is a form of deception, and is not allowed as it can cause psychological or physiological harm to a participant. Because this was a quick decision that was rushed, there is no risk assessment put into place, which is essential before an experiment is allowed to take place. To do this, the 5-step approach must be used in order to make sure that there are safety procedures and the risk has been reduced as much as possible. The steps include identifying the hazard, seeing and deciding on who it may harm, evaluating the risk, recording the severity of it, and finally, reviewing and updating it if possible. Also, the participants did not give permission to participate in the experiment and were instead prompted to do so. Due to this, participants were no longer volunteers and therefore do not follow the guidelines of the Declaration of Helsinki. This could lead to consequences such as termination of bases accreditation and ethical training. Because the Declaration of Helsinki states that the experiment must be ethically clear, the Ethics Committee will look at and review the request, and if the experiment is not cleared by the Ethics Committee, it cannot be done. If a researcher carries out the experiment without ethical clearance from the committee, serious consequences can occur. If physical or psychological harm is brought upon anyone, either the participant or researcher, consequences will become even more severe, such as formal reprimand or even a fine. Due to the verbal abuse of the researchers to the participant, this has led to physical and a high likelihood of psychological harm as well. This is because it is against the Declaration of Helsinki to do so. So it is the researcher's responsibility to look after the participant. However, the participant sustained 2 types of harm, which will merit severe consequence for the researcher. When the boy showed discomfort, The researcher should have terminated the test for him, as the participant both showed signs of discomfort and wanted to withdraw, meaning that the researcher must terminate the test to prevent harm to the participant and to respect his wish of withdrawing. He also failed to do so as he did not have a health screening with any of the subjects to make sure they were all healthy, and failed to apply first aid to an injured participant. Because a participant was harmed, the researcher may face a fine or even termination of his job as he failed to do his responsibility of caring for the participant. The researcher fails to prepare his participant as he opts to skip the warm-up due to a lack of time. This means the test sequence is now out of order, again leading to the girls not having enough time to complete their testing, as the researcher also opted for the boys to go first, meaning there is an inequality present. These are all faults with the researcher, which are not allowed to take place, as they can lead to consequences such as supervision, where the researcher will be observed by another researcher in future experiments, or a termination of BASIS accreditation, meaning you will lose whatever credit you have gained whilst a part of BASIS, making it harder to find a job.